Good afternoon. Here begins media number 1 in the deposition of Linda Tracy in the matter of Planned Parenthood Federation of America Incorporated et al. Versus the Center for Medical Progress et al. This case is in the United States District Court, Northern District of California, and the case number is 3:16-CV-00236 WHO. Today's date is October 30th, 2019. The time is 1:02 p.m. This deposition is taking place at 405 Howard Street, 10th floor, San Francisco, California, 94105. The videographer is Alfredo Domador, appearing on behalf of the Sullivan Group of Court Reporters. Would counsel please identify yourselves and state whom you represent?
Paul Jonah on behalf of defendants David Daleiden, Center for Medical Progress, Biomax Procurement Services, and Adrian Lopez.
Diane Stirk on behalf of plaintiffs.
Karen Johnson McEwen from Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe on behalf of the witness today.
Thank you, counsel. The reporter today is Krishana Derrida with Sullivan. Would the reporter please swear in the witness, and we can begin.
And raise your right hand. You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in the cause of paper shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do. And before we start, can we just identify everyone else for the record?
Oh, David Daleiden's also here with me.
And Molly McCafferty, an associate at Orrick, is also with me.
Okay. Good afternoon, Ms. Tracy. Can you please state and spell your name for the record?
Linda Tracy, Linda Tracy.
Thank you. Have you ever been deposed before?
Yes,
How many times approximately?
once.
And what was the context?
It was a child custody case.
Okay. So I just want to quickly go through the ground rules. I'm sure you're aware of them, but the most important one is that you're under oath. And the oath that you just took is the same oath you would take if you were testifying in front of a judge and jury in a courtroom. Do you understand that?
I do.
And the same penalties of perjury apply. Do you understand that?
I do.
Please don't. If you answer my question, I'm going to assume you understood it. If you need me to clarify, I'm happy to do so. So it's just important that you only answer questions that you understand. Does that make sense?
Yes.
There's a court reporter taking down what's being said in this room, so it's important we try not to talk over each other. Are you under the influence of any drugs or alcohol that could affect your ability to recall facts?
No.
Okay. Is there any reason why you can't give your best testimony today?
No.
You understand that you're not a party to this case. You've been subpoenaed as a third party, and you're testifying in that capacity, correct?
Yes.
Have you ever been convicted of a felony?
No.
Have you ever been charged with a crime?
No.
Have you ever been interviewed by law enforcement in connection with your work at ABR?
No.
Have you ever been interviewed by Congress?
Yes.
Approximately when?
I believe that was either in the fall of 15 or the spring of 16. Can't recall. I think it was the spring of 16.
Was it just one occasion?
Yes.
What was the nature of the interview? What was it regarding?
It was the House Committee and the Senate Committee on Marsha Blackburn's committee. I can't think of the name of it right now.
Sure. Without getting into all the details, do you remember generally what the nature of the interview was focused on?
They were curious about how ABR's program worked and wanted me to explain.
Okay. Were you asked to provide them with documents?
Yes.
And did you?
Yes.
Do you remember generally what you provided them with?
Objections is outside the scope of what Judge Orrick has allowed this deposition to be about.
And I think I'll instruct the witness not to answer questions that fall outside the scope of what Judge Orrick has permitted. So
Yeah.
I'll instruct you not to answer
So
that
Judge
question.
Orrick didn't prohibit us from going into general background and issues regarding credibility and bias, and so there'll be questions along those lines today, but you make your instructions and we'll deal with them however we see fit.
For the record, in the case, everything regarding the congressional hearings has been barred from coming into the case, so
Okay.
there's no relevance
Okay.
in this deposition.
I'll stand by my instruction.
Sure. So the question was, what documents did you provide Congress?
I'm instructing the witness not to answer.
Okay. Were you the person responsible at ABR for gathering the documents that had to be provided to Congress?
Same instruction.
Do you recall being subpoenaed by the defendants in this civil case to provide documents in this lawsuit?
In this lawsuit.
Yes.
And were you the person responsible for locating and gathering those documents?
Yes.
And those documents consisted of invoices. I assume you're the person at ABR responsible for maintaining custody of those?
Mm-hmm.
That's a yes?
Yes.
Okay. And what did you do to prepare for today's deposition?
I met with Karen yesterday.
On one occasion or on more than one occasion?
Just one.
For approximately how long?
An hour. Excuse me.
Did you review any documents to prepare for today's deposition?
No.
Did you watch any videos to prepare for today's deposition?
No.
Can you summarize briefly your educational background, please?
I'm a registered nurse.
So you obtained a nursing degree of some kind at some point?
I did.
Where and when?
It was in 1975 from a college in Southern California.
Okay. Any other education after high school?
No.
Can you summarize your work experience after obtaining your degree until the present?
I worked in critical care in hospitals in Southern California primarily, and did what nurses do in critical care.
Okay, and how long did you do that for?
Since 1975 to about 83.
Okay, and what did you do next?
Then in 83, I started working for the Regional Organ Procurement Agency in
I'm sorry for the way.
Regional Organ Procurement Agency, ROPA, at UCLA as a donor coordinator.
Okay, and what exactly were your responsibilities as a donor coordinator?
I would, when a patient presented to the hospital in brain death and the families had consented for organ donation, excuse me, they would call in a team, and I was the principal coordinator of that team, so that when the patient was ready for donation, everything was in order.
Can we go off the record for 1 second?
Sure. We're going off the record time is 1:10 p.m.
I just realized I...
We are back on the record time is 1:13 p.m.
Okay, so you were discussing your role in this position as a donor coordinator, and I believe you said you were the principal coordinator, and just so I understand correctly, this involves adult organ donation?
Yes.
And how long were you in this role for?
2 years.
Okay. And what did you do after this?
Then I started working for a company called HANA Biologics, H-A-N-A, and they were in Berkeley.
And what do they do?
They were a biotech that was researching cures or therapies for Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, and Parkinson's disease.
So why did you decide to leave nursing and get into this position as a donor coordinator?
I didn't leave nursing.
So you were acting as a nurse?
Yes.
Okay. And then this, the role at HANA Biologics, what was your title there?
I was procurement manager.
What would you do as procurement manager?
I was hired there to network sources for them for fetal tissue.
What does that mean, network sources?
Call providers of abortion services to see if they would participate in the program.
And where was this company located?
Berkeley.
And which abortion providers were you contacting?
Objection, outside the scope.
And I think I'll instruct her not to answer on that
Or
basis.
is it just general background information?
Yeah, I know, but you've got a very limited subject and limited time, so you've got information about what she was doing and who she was working for, so.
Were you working with Planned Parenthood affiliates at the time?
Objection, outside the scope.
I'm gonna instruct.
Not to discuss her work with the plaintiffs in this case?
Right.
Okay. I'm going to ask the question again. At the time that you were working with this firm in Berkeley, were you working with any Planned Parenthood affiliates?
I'm gonna instruct her not to
Same
answer.
Okay.
Same
And
objection.
how long did you work at that organization for?
Almost 5 years.
Okay. And where did you go after
88,
that?
89. Then I started ABR,
Okay. What's ABR?
Advanced Bioscience Resources Incorporated.
And what does ABR do?
Acquires and distributes fetal tissue for research purposes.
Is that similar to what the group did in Berkeley?
Objection mischaracterizes prior testimony. You can answer.
I was the group at Berkeley.
Hannah Biologics?
Yes.
Okay. So why did you decide to start your own group?
The research community was beginning to grow in their requirements for more tissue, and the company, the clinics were getting more and more calls from researchers who wanted to come into the clinics and collect the tissue themselves, but it was more private and more convenient for me or my entity to go in and be the one resource for a variety of researchers. So I could make it easier for the clinic, make it easier for the researchers.
Is ABR's business model similar to that of Hannah Biologics?
No.
What's different about them?
Objection, outside the scope.
I think she's already explained to you what Hannah Biologics does. She told you what she did at Hannah Biologics, which is different from what the company does. She's not engaged in medical research at ABR, and you know that.
Counsel, that's a speaking objection. I'm just asking her the difference between the model at ABR, the company you founded, and the prior company you were working at, Hannah Biologics.
Same objection, outside the scope.
You can answer that question, but we're going to really limit this going forward.
So Hannah Biologics hired me to be their procurement department. So what I did for Hannah was exactly what I did and do for ABR.
And why was it that Hannah asked you to do that, to do the fetal tissue procurement?
Objection asked and answered, and lacks foundation. You can answer the question if you know it, if you know the answer. Why they hired you?
They hired me to network sources for them for fetal tissue, as I said.
Was that something that you wanted to get into, or did they ask you to get involved in that line of their work?
I wanted to.
What was it that made you interested in that?
I thought the research was extremely beneficial, and it is.
What research are you referring to?
Diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and a multitude of others.
And was Hannah Biologics part of the National Disease Research Interchange?
No.
Okay. Did you work with the National Disease Research Interchange in the 1980s?
Yes.
And what time frame?
I don't remember.
Was that a separate position, or was that, because you didn't describe that?
They were already doing fetal tissue acquisition, NDRI was, and James Bardsley, I think his name was, offered to help me in identifying different types of tissues. So he worked with me for maybe a month. I'm not sure. So I was never an employee of NDRI, but we had a relationship.
And the time frame again? Was that that's before you founded ABR?
Yeah,
Before you worked at Hannah Biologics or after?
during the same time.
Okay. And ABR's been in business since what year? 1989, is that what you said?
Yes.
And how has ABR's business model changed since it was opened, or has it been the same? How would you describe, its growth since 1989?
Objection, vague and ambiguous, compound.
Objection outside the scope.
You can answer. You just, describe ABR's business.
It's the same.
Okay. How many employees do you have?
9.
How many locations do you have?
1,
And where's that?
Alameda, California.
And how many procurement technicians do you have?
5.
Do you focus on a certain region?
4, sorry.
4.
No,
And are your clients nationwide?
yes.
Do you do more of your work predominantly in one state, or is it just all across the United States?
In various places in the United States, yes.
Approximately how many clients do you have?
I'm going to object. This is getting very intrusive into ABR's business. Ms. Tracy is here to testify about a very limited subject, and the intrusion into the details of her business is inappropriate, so I'm going to instruct her not to answer any further questions about that.
Join the objection.
Has ABR made contributions to the Alameda Christian Reformed Church?
I'm going to object that falls outside the scope of the order and instruct the witness not to answer.
Are you going to answer the question?
No.
Is that your church?
I'm going to object again, instruct the witness not to answer.
Is it true that ABR has made financial contributions to pro-life pregnancy centers?
I'm going to object and instruct the witness not to answer.
Join.
Which Planned Parenthood affiliates has ABR worked with?
I'm going to object and instruct the witness not to answer outside the scope.
Join.
Well, it's certainly relevant to her bias, and so Yeah.
You haven't established that any reason to doubt whatever her testimony is going to be on the subject for which you are allowed to ask questions. So before you start talking about bias, why don't you ask her the questions that you've been authorized to ask her,
Well-
and then we can talk about the rest.
yeah, that's fine. I'm just making my record. So, do you currently work with Planned Parenthood Pacific Southwest?
I'm going to object and instruct the witness not to answer.
Join.
Have you ever attended a NAF conference?
Yes.
Approximately how many have you attended?
Maybe 20.
And why do you attend those?
To talk to friends.
Any other reason?
To, I don't know, let them know about the value of fetal tissue research and how they can participate.
And when you say talk to friends, what friends are you referring to?
Friends that I've made in the clinics.
Which clinics?
I'm going to object that that calls for information about the conduct of ABR's business and instruct her not to answer.
Are there certain affiliates or abortion providers that you're looking to network with when you go to NAF conferences?
That's a yes or no question.
Yes.
Which ones?
I'm going to object and instruct her not to answer.
Yes.
When you attend NAF conferences, are you attending as an exhibitor?
No.
What are you attending as?
A member.
A member. Okay. Have you ever attended a NAF conference as an exhibitor?
Yes.
Approximately when?
It was, I'm not exactly sure, but I think it was in the early 90s.
And why is it that you don't exhibit at NAF conferences anymore?
Why I don't?
Yes.
Because I would rather go and be part of the sessions and listen to what is being said and to just be there and not have to exhibit.
So the last time ABR exhibited at a NAF conference was in the 90s?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. And has ABR been able to obtain new clients and new business by attending NAF conferences?
I'm going to object and instruct her not to answer. That is not within the scope of the authorized testimony.
Join.
It's certainly relevant to know why she attends NAF conferences.
She's told you why she attends
I'm
NAF
allowed to
conferences.
explore that further and ask additional questions. So what we'll do is we'll just bring her back after we raise this issue with Judge Orrick. So I'm just letting you know.
Then I'm letting
So
you
you're
know.
I can't even ask her why I'm not supposed to accept the
she's told
first
you.
answer she gives me, and I can't follow up.
She's told you why she
Okay.
attends.
And I'm entitled to follow up.
What was your
counsel.
last question?
Can you read back my last question, please?
Has ABR been able to obtain new clients and new business by attending NAF conferences?
Okay, no. I'm standing by my instruction.
Okay. Do any of your competitors exhibit at NAF conferences, to your knowledge?
Objection to the characterization.
You can answer.
You can go ahead and answer.
I don't know.
Do you have any competitors?
Foundation, but you can answer the question.
I'm not sure.
Would you consider STEM Express a competitor?
Consider.
STEM Express.
At one point they were. I'm not sure that they still are.
Why do you say that?
My understanding is that they've changed the focus of their work a little bit.
In which way?
Objection outside the scope.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm going to instruct you not to answer.
How long have they not been a competitor in your view?
Probably 3 years. 4 years, since 2015, since the videos and all that BS came out.
What is it about the videos?
Objection outside the scope.
Yeah, I'm going to object too. And it lacks foundation.
I'm following up on your client's answer to my question. What was it about the videos that you said led to a change in how you view STEM Express as a competitor?
Same objection.
Yeah, and that mischaracterizes her prior testimony.
You said at one point STEM Express was a competitor, and about 3 or 4 years ago after the videos, they stopped being a competitor in your view because they changed focus. Is that correct?
I'm going to object that does mischaracterize her prior testimony.
Well, she can tell me, counsel.
Yes.
That's correct. Okay, so what was it about the videos that caused that change?
Objection outside the scope.
Objection, foundation. You can answer that one.
She was intimidated and frightened by threats, and so she focused on acquiring other types of tissues instead of fetal tissues.
And how do you know that?
Her website.
Anything else?
No,
Did you speak to her about that?
no.
When's the last time you spoke to Kate Dyer?
I think in 2017.
Was that at a NAF conference?
No,
Where was that?
at an ISSCR conference.
What does that stand for?
International Society for Stem Cell Research.
Have you ever seen STEM Express at NAF conferences when you attended them?
Yes.
Are there other fetal tissue procurement organizations that you've seen at NAF conferences in the past?
Not that I recall.
Do you consider Novogenics a competitor?
I forgot about them. I suppose so.
What about Da Vinci Biologics when they existed?
I suppose so. You could call them that, but
Let's take a look at 3 exhibits. 4500, 4501, and 4502.
May I have copies?
Sure.
Oh, I think they've been, have these already been marked?
I have copies for you as well, so I'll give them to you afterwards.
Oh, okay, so I thought you were handing those to the witness.
Yeah, that's fine. We can mark that set.
Yeah. So you've given me one. This is
Okay.
4501?
That's 4500. This is 4501. This is 4502. Okay, so the first exhibit that I handed you is Exhibit 4500, and I want to turn your attention to page 405. It has a Bates number of 4500-0005, and this document is a Department of Justice, Bureau of Law Enforcement, Division of Law Enforcement, Bureau of Investigation report. And page 405 says, the first full paragraph, on November 17th, 2016, I talked with Linda Tracy, owner of Advanced Bioscience Resource, ABR. I informed Tracy about the investigation, inquired about her speaking with Dyer, posing as Robert Sarkis at the NAF conference held in San Francisco in 2014. Tracy said while attending the conference, she vaguely recalled talking with Dyer and a female she believed was Susan at the Biomax booth. Tracy stated she did not know she was being recorded and felt the conversation was not private due to the amount of people walking around. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a yes?
Yes.
Okay, I'd like you to look at Exhibit 4501, which is the next exhibit there. I want you to turn to page 452 on the top right. This document
Sorry,
is
which page?
452.
It's got Bates number 038 at the bottom.
This
Okay.
document is a transcript of proceedings and preliminary hearing in the matter of People of the State of California versus David Robert Dyer and Sandra Susan Merritt, and dated September 10th, 2019. And this is sworn testimony under oath by Agent Cardwell. And on page 452, these are questions and answers during the proceeding. The question posed to Agent Cardwell was, were there any other individuals that you crossed off the list as potential victims? Answer, yes, there was the owner of Advanced, or ABR, Advanced Bio Research, I believe, Linda Tracy. Question, and why did you cross her off the list? Answer, she did not feel the brief conversation that she had with Mr. Delyden at the Biomax exhibit was confidential. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, I'd like you to look at the next exhibit, which is also a transcript of the same proceedings, but on September 12th, 2019. I want to turn your attention to page 794 on the top right. Bates number 4502-0004. And at the very bottom, line 26, it says, and I recall, this is again questioning with Agent Cardwell, and I recall that you mentioned that you ruled out Linda Tracy of ABR and her colleague, Perrin Larton. Did I hear that correctly? Answer, yes. And then it goes on, line 14, and after you watched the video, you called and had a telephone discussion with Miss Linda Tracy, correct? Answer, yes. Question, and as a result of watching the video and having a telephone discussion, you concluded that there was no probable cause for that a violation under 632 occurred as to them, correct? Answer, yes. She didn't believe that the conversation that she had was confidential. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And it's accurate, isn't it, that you thought that your conversation with David Delyden at the NAV conference was neither private nor confidential, correct?
Correct.
And that's because there were people around that could overhear the conversation, correct?
Correct.
Do you recall the conversation that you had with Agent Cardwell that he recalls in his testimony?
No.
But it's accurate. What he recaps is accurate. His conclusions are accurate, correct?
I don't know who he is.
You don't recall speaking to any investigator from the department in connection with this case with the Department of Justice?
In September of this year?
No, the report, the first exhibit we looked at is dated November 28th, 2016. His name is Brian Cardwell. He's a special agent with the California Department of Justice.
I don't recall that at all.
Okay. The conversation that you had with David Delyden at the NAV conference, what do you remember about it?
It was mostly just a greeting.
Do you remember where you were?
His booth was in a corner.
In the exhibit hall?
Yes, outside of the main exhibit hall, as I recall. It was rather a dark corner.
Okay. Was there anybody else present during the conversation besides you and him?
Susan was there.
Anyone else?
I'm not sure. Perrin might have been there.
Okay. Let's take a quick look at the first video exhibit, which is 5402-3. I have copies of the thumb drives if you want. It's really bad quality, but I just want you to listen and see what you remember. Do the volume on?
Yes.
What did you say the exhibit number was again? Sorry.
5402-3. Yeah, let's go off the record for a second, please.
We're going off the record. Time is 1:39 p.m.
So,
We are back on the record. time is 1:43 p.m.
Before we look at the video, I just have a couple of follow-up questions. Is it to your testimony that you know nothing about the California Department of Justice investigation into the recordings at issue in this case?
Objection.
I'm going to object that that mischaracterizes her prior testimony.
So your testimony before was that you don't recall speaking to Agent Cardwell. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you recall speaking to anybody at the California Department of Justice about the CMP videos?
I don't.
Do you recall speaking to anybody at the Attorney General's office about the CMP videos?
No.
Do you recall speaking to anyone from Planned Parenthood about a criminal case in connection with the CMP videos?
Objection. Vague.
Would you mind reading the question back? I don't think I caught all of it.
Do you recall speaking to anyone from Planned Parenthood about a criminal case in connection with the CMP video?
Okay. You can answer that question.
Probably, but I don't recall when or any details about it.
Do you recall who you spoke to?
No.
Did you speak to Beth Parker about a criminal case involving the CMP videos?
I spoke to Beth Parker.
Do you remember what she told you?
No.
Was it about the CMP videos?
I don't know.
When was the last time you spoke to Beth Parker?
Maybe 6 months ago. I don't know exactly.
Do you remember what you were speaking to her about?
About Planned Parenthood clinics.
Anything regarding this lawsuit or the criminal
No.
case? Are you aware that there is a criminal case in connection with the CMP videos?
Yes.
How are you aware of that?
It's general knowledge.
Do you remember how you became aware of that? For example, who told you?
Not exactly.
Do you remember when you first learned?
No.
So it's your testimony that you don't recall ever being interviewed in connection with the California Department of Justice criminal case regarding the CMP videos.
Objection. Asked and answered.
Same objection. Asked and answered. You can answer the question.
I don't recall.
Are you aware if ABR is currently under investigation?
Objection. Outside the scope.
Yeah, and I'm going to instruct you not to answer that question.
Let's take a look at 5402-3. This is a video from the 2014 NAF conference. We still don't have volume. Oh, yeah, we do.
Fires in Southern California. Where are you? Alameda. Alameda. Oh, okay. And I'm sorry, this is the name that you were, the person that you were talking about. I know it's the name is from Civic Stuff. Yeah. What a horror story. Well, I could just hearing that little tiny bit, I can understand why. Yeah, yeah.
hard to see that and hard to hear, but I want to ask you a few questions about the video we just watched. First of all, do you remember having that conversation at the NAF conference with Susan Merritt?
Not exactly, no.
Does any of it ring a bell to you at all?
No.
Do you, were you able to, I know it's hard to see, were you able to recognize where you were?
No.
Can you tell that you were in the exhibit hall?
It could have been anywhere.
Do you remember the discussion you had with Susan where you were talking about how STEM Express was started when Kate Dyer stole information from ABR and left to start her own business?
I couldn't really hear that very clearly, so I can't answer that.
Do you remember discussing that, though, with Susan Merritt?
Not particularly, no.
Do you remember telling her that Kate Dyer had backstabbed you, but she's charismatic and endearing? And you also said she lies. Do you remember that discussion at all?
I remember having that discussion with some people. I don't know that it was Susan.
And Kate Dyer used to work for ABR?
Yes.
When did she stop working for ABR?
I don't know exactly.
When did she start working for ABR?
I don't know exactly.
And is it, I think I heard you say, but I just want to confirm, is it your position that she stole business information from ABR to found STEM Express?
Yes.
Do you know what she stole?
Researcher information?
Did you ever sue her?
No.
And why not?
The lawyer that I contacted suggested that it would be hard to prove.
Wait, I'm going to ask you not to disclose attorney-client communications. And counsel,
Sorry.
can you explain to me how this relates to the scope of the authorized testimony?
I'm trying to understand the context of the statement she's making at the NAF conference, which the statements themselves are relevant to understand the expectation of confidentiality. So.
Yeah, you haven't actually established that she knows where this video was taken or that she remembers the conversation.
So, well, you remember discussing these subject matters with different people over the years, you said, and it wouldn't surprise you if you were talking about that at the NAF conference with Susan Merritt, would it?
Objective form.
Yeah, I'm going to object to that question too, but to the form of that question. But you can answer it if you can recall.
Could you rephrase the question, please?
You're not disputing that you spoke to Susan Merritt about the subject matter we're discussing, about Kate Dyer's background with ABR and the fact that she stole information from ABR. It wouldn't surprise you to have a discussion like that with someone at a NAF conference, would it?
Objective form. Just characterize the testimony.
Yeah, same objections.
Do you understand the question?
Yes. I guess it wouldn't surprise me.
Do you remember meeting David Delyden and Susan and the folks at Biomax at the NAF conference in 2014?
Yes.
And you remember talking to them at their exhibit booth?
Yes.
And you don't remember anything about the conversation?
Not really.
Let's take a look at another clip from the same conference. This is Exhibit 5402-4. Can we dim the lights in the room to see if we can see it better? Yeah. Sorry.
conference, which is a bit more complicated than it used to be. That's his
For the longest time, our company was one of three in the country. So it was NDI, it was ABR, no, it was New York Blood Center, they have a pediatrician representation center, and UW, University of Washington in San Diego. And now,
Do you at least recognize your voice?
Yes.
Okay, so that's you. Does that conversation ring a bell at all?
No.
Okay. Do you recognize Susan Merritt's voice?
No.
Did you ever tell Susan Merritt or David Delyden that you were having a confidential communication with them at the NAF conference?
No.
You didn't do anything to suggest it was confidential because you didn't think it was confidential, right?
Thought it was safe.
But you didn't think it was confidential.
I thought it was safe.
So the answer is yes to my question. You did not think it was confidential.
Yes.
Okay. Let's take a look at Exhibit 4509. Do you remember also speaking to David Delyden at an ISSCR conference?
Yes.
And what can you tell me generally the difference between that conference and the NAF conference?
ISSCR is primarily for researchers who are looking to develop their research.
Okay. Can you offer the record for a second, please?
Sure. We're going off the record. Time is 1:57 p.m.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
We're back on the record. Time is 1:58 p.m.
I'm going to play Exhibit 5409. I'm going to start at 10:38:26.
For the record, I object to this video and to testimony regarding it, as this is not a conference that's at issue in this case.
No, it's okay. You don't have to. Oh, yeah, if you can, sure. Judge Orrick said that we're allowed to ask about trade shows. He didn't say NAF trade shows.
Well, he obviously meant, for the record, he obviously meant trade shows that were at issue in the case,
Okay.
in the Planned Parenthood case, which does not involve the conference that's being shown
Okay.
on Exhibit 4509.
Well,
So let me make sure I know
Yeah.
what exhibit we're talking about, because I've heard 4509 and 5409, and I don't know which it is.
we're at 4509.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
It's on.
Yeah.
Then again.
Man after my own heart. He says, why don't they just do induction so we get better tissue?
I thought it was going to be intact. I didn't realize that it just
No. So then they threw them out. Yeah. And it's you know, it's coming transvaginally, so it can be contaminated with whatever's in there. So
Did you say have you ever gotten them intact? There was one or two cases with the.
every once in a while we
Every
get them
once in a while.
intact, but it's never completely intact.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, unless, like I told you, the example of the woman gets to the stirrups and the fetus is down the canal because
Right.
she had, you know, 14 kids or
Yeah.
something. So
Yeah. How long would you say? How long from cessation of circulation?
that we send the tissue to
Yeah.
you, immediate. I mean,
Yeah.
like I said, we're in the lab, so they bring it out within 5 minutes now. It's like we have it
Yeah.
in media and it's ready to go out
Yeah.
the door.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Well. Yeah. I just like I was telling her, I still have to submit like through the graduate studies portal and stuff my university application to get like funding and a major professor and all of that. So fingers crossed it'll all work out. It's longer than I would like, but
Yeah.
I don't have $1,000 to spend on tissue just of my own. So
Yeah, exactly. Right.
it's too bad. But and it's per specimen, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Now, if let's let's say my major professor or someone else in the department was also doing a study, is there any way to buy in bulk, or if we wanted just a whole cadaver, and then we did our own dissection?
We don't do whole cadavers just because we rarely get them.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So,
Actually, I was going to say, well.
Okay, so I stopped it at 10:40:21. Do you remember this discussion with David Daleiden at the ISSCR conference?
Yeah. Not completely, but yes.
And you recognize yourself in the video?
Yes.
And that's Perrin Larton to your right in the video?
Yes.
And in the discussion, Perrin Larton talks about fetuses falling out in front of you, and she testified in this case that she's harvested organs from fetuses whose hearts were still beating. Are you aware of that?
Objection, mischaracterizes the video.
And I'm also going to object. This is outside the scope.
Have you had similar discussions at NAF conferences?
Objection.
So, I'm going to object that that's vague and ambiguous.
You can answer the question.
No.
Have you ever had discussions about intact specimens and harvesting organs from fetuses whose hearts were still beating at NAF conferences?
No.
Do you remember if, when you attend the NAF conferences, if you had to sign a confidentiality agreement?
Always.
And what is your understanding of what that agreement entails? Or strike that. Is it your understanding that, how do you understand that agreement to apply? What's your understanding of that agreement?
That when a person attends the meeting, they are who they say they are, who they represent themselves as. They are absolutely pro-choice. They are bound by a rule and promise of following the NAF regulations about no videotaping without permission, no recording without permission, and providing a safe environment for everyone in attendance.
What makes you think that the agreement requires everyone to be pro-choice?
Because NAF is pro-choice.
Are you pro-choice?
Yes.
And is it your understanding that if you were to learn, if someone were to learn that there was criminal activity being discussed at a NAF conference, that they couldn't disclose that to other people because the confidentiality agreement prevents them from doing that?
Objection. Form, Lux Foundation.
I don't understand the question.
Do you think that the NAF confidentiality agreement prevents people from disclosing criminal activity that's being discussed at a NAF conference?
Object to form.
What criminal activity?
If someone were to learn or hear discussion of criminal activity, do you think the NAF confidentiality agreement prevents people from being able to disclose that outside the NAF conference?
I don't
Same
know.
objection.
If you were to learn that people at the NAF conference were engaged in criminal activity, would you report that to authorities?
Same objection.
Objection calls for speculation. Lux Foundation.
Can you answer the question?
Repeat the question, please.
Can you please read back my question?
If you were to learn that people at the NAF conference were engaged in criminal activity, would you report that to authorities?
Calls for speculation. Lux Foundation. You
Join.
can answer.
I don't know.
Okay. When you testified earlier about the distinction in your mind between a conversation being safe versus being confidential, do you recall that testimony?
Yes. Mhm.
What were you trying to, what did you mean when you said safe?
That it was a safe environment, that discussions that were being held whether casual or formal, would be treated as that it would be okay to talk to another pro-choice person about such things.
Have you ever discussed pricing of fetal tissue at NAF conferences?
Careful with your mic.
So sorry. I suppose so, yes.
Can you just generally explain the nature of those discussions that you'd have at NAF?
Objection vague.
And I want you to be careful here not to disclose anything about the way ABR conducts its business. So that's a yes or no question. Have you ever discussed pricing at conferences?
My last question wasn't yes or no.
Okay. What was your last question? Can you read it back, please?
Can you just generally explain the nature of those discussions that you had at NAF?
Well, then I'm going to instruct her not to answer because that intrudes into ABR's business practices.
I think we're entitled to know generally how your client, handles confidentiality at NAF conferences and what topics are discussed generally. I'm not asking for details. I'm asking on a high level. You said you talked to folks at NAF about fetal tissue pricing, and I'm just trying to get a general high-level understanding of what those discussions entail.
I think you need to be more specific about what you're looking for because she's given you the high level that she has talked about pricing. If there's something more specific you're looking for, please ask so that we can measure the objection.
Okay. Can you tell me what you recall in that regard discussing fetal tissue pricing at NAF conferences?
Don't disclose the details of any discussions about pricing, please.
I suppose when we discussed the service that we provide, the fee for the service came into play, but it was never emphasized, or that was never the first order of discussion.
Have you ever discussed your regulated tissue acquisition agreements with folks at NAF conferences?
That's a yes or no.
Yes.
And in those agreements, the researchers pay ABR up to $6,000 for a strike that. What do you remember discussing about the RTA agreements at NAF conferences?
Again, just at a high level, please don't disclose any details about how ABR conducts its operations.
I probably discussed that it was an optional service that we offer to researchers.
And for a CGTP compliant tissue acquisition, the service fee is $6,000 for a completed phase 2 acquisition. Is that correct?
I'm going to object and instruct the witness not to answer. That does not pertain to expectations of confidentiality at the NAF conference, and it intrudes into the operations of ABR's business.
Have you
Join.
Do you recall discussing the details of your RTA agreement at NAF conferences?
Objection asked and answered.
Yeah. And that's a yes or no question.
Have I discussed it?
Yes.
Perhaps, yes.
Do you remember discussing the fees associated with that agreement with people at NAF conferences?
No.
Do you remember discussing with abortion clinics what kind of revenues that they would expect to receive by partnering with ABR
Objection outside the scope.
at NAF conferences?
I'm still going to instruct the witness not to answer because that's getting into operations at ABR and business discussions.
And in that conversation that we looked at, you discussed, or you and Per Martin discussed, in response to questions from Biomax, whether they could obtain intact fetal tissue specimens. Did you recall that?
Are you talking about the video that's currently up on the screen, 4509?
Yes.
That was not a NAF conference, was it? I think your question assumed that it was.
I'm sorry. In the video that we just watched, do you recall discussing with David Daleiden and Susan Merritt in response to their question about obtaining intact fetal tissue specimens, whether ABR could provide intact specimens? Do you recall that discussion?
Objection, outside the scope.
And I'll instruct her not to answer on that basis.
Do you recall confirming to David Daleiden at this conference that ABR pays clinics per specimen?
Objection, outside the scope.
And I'll instruct the witness not to answer on that basis.
Okay. What percentage of revenue to ABR would you say Planned Parenthood affiliates constitute?
Objection, outside the scope.
And I'll instruct the witness not to answer on that basis.
How many Planned Parenthood affiliates does ABR work with?
Same
I'm not
object-
asking for the specific ones, I'm just asking how many.
I am still going to instruct her not to answer that question. It gets into ABR's businesses and doesn't have anything to do with expectation of confidentiality at the NAF conferences.
Join.
Okay. Can we off the record for a second?
We're going off the record time is 2:12 p.m. We're back on the record time is 2:22 p.m.
Good afternoon, Ms. Tracy.
Hi.
I'm Diana Sturck from Planned Parenthood, where I
Thank you.
represent Planned Parenthood. I think you testified earlier that you are a NAF member. Is that correct?
Yes.
How long have you been a NAF member for?
Since the early 90s, as far as I recall. I don't know exactly what year.
And do you recall the process that you had to go through to become a NAF member?
Yes.
What did you have to do?
First, you make application to NAF, and and you have to identify a sponsor that will vet for you, basically, and list that person or persons on the application.
And what other information did you have to provide to NAF before becoming a member?
I don't know.
Did you have to provide information about your business?
At the time, I think that I just joined as an individual member, not as a business member. And so it was just my professional background, my RN licensure, and where I worked.
And you said that you needed a sponsor or reference of some sort on the application?
Right, a current NAF member that would vet for me or sponsor me.
And why was it that you became a NAF member?
I wanted to be able to provide more services to the researchers, and so I wanted to discuss ABR's program with other abortion providers so that more tissue could be acquired.
And you said that you've attended NAF conferences for a number of years as well.
Yes.
When you attend NAF conferences, what information, or do you have to register in advance?
Yes.
And what do you have to do to register for the NAF conference?
So once the conference is announced, then you can register if you're a current NAF member in good standing. And there are fees for the conference that are paid, and then you get the information.
And you said that once the conference is announced, you can do that. How is it that the conference is announced?
Through a private email.
Do you know who's on that email?
Not specifically, no.
Do you know if NAF announces its conferences to the general public?
No, they do not.
You said that you were an exhibitor at NAF back in the 1990s. Do you recall at all what you had to do to become an exhibitor prior to the conference?
It was the same type of vetting where you make application, and as a current NAF member, an individual, that allowed me to also not sponsor, but to exhibit, to ask to be an exhibitor.
And attending the NAF conferences in 2014 and 2015, was it your expectation that exhibitors who attended those would have to go through a similar process?
Absolutely, yes.
When you actually arrived at the NAF conferences, what did you have to do to get into the conference space?
So the conferences would be on a separate floor usually, or a separate area in the hotel or venue where the conference was being held. And that information also was usually distributed to the through the email, so that the attendees could know where to go in the hotel or the venue. And
oh, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
okay. So then you go to a specific area where the registration takes place, and they give you your badge and identifiers, and then you sign the confidentiality agreement.
You said that the conference space is usually on a separate floor of the hotel. Do you mean by that it's not on the ground floor?
Yes.
And are there signs for the NAF conference to advertise where to go once you enter the hotel?
Sometimes. There might be a marquee in the main floor that identifies it, but usually it's a private information that goes out to the membership.
You said that one of the things you have to do before entering is get a badge, is that right?
Right.
What did you have to present to NAF in order to get a badge?
My driver's license. That's it.
And then once you got a badge, what did you have to do with it at the conference, or what were you supposed to do with it?
Always wear it.
Was there somebody checking for badges when you entered the conference?
Always, everywhere.
And was it your expectation that everybody who got a badge had shown their ID?
Yes.
Other than somebody checking badges and IDs, were there any other security measures that you observed at NAF conferences?
They had dogs. The security was very in tune to what was happening, very observant.
Did you ever enter a NAF conference without a badge on?
No, and get stopped every time.
Mark Exhibit 8100. Ms. Tracy, do you recognize Exhibit 8100?
Yes,
What is it?
the confidentiality agreement that I signed.
And if you look at the first page, there's a date at the bottom that says April 5th, 2014. Do you see that?
Yes,
And is that the date that you signed the first page of Exhibit 8100?
yes,
If you turn to the second page, there's a date that's April 18th, 2015. Do you see that?
yes,
And is that the date that you signed the second page of Exhibit 8100?
yes,
And if you look at the top of the first page of 8100, it says Confidentiality Agreement for NAF Annual Meeting, April 5th through 8th, 2014. Do you see that?
yes,
And do you understand that to mean that this was the confidentiality agreement you signed prior to entering the NAF meeting in 2014?
yes,
And is the same true for the second page except for 2015?
yes.
And I want to draw your attention to the first sentence of the agreement, and it says it's NAF policy that all people attending its conferences, in parentheses, attendees, sign this confidentiality agreement. Do you see that?
Yes.
And was that your understanding that everybody who attended the NAF conferences had to sign a confidentiality agreement?
Yes.
And then the first number 1 underneath that says videotaping or other recording prohibited. Do you see that?
Yes.
And what was your understanding of that first clause?
That there would be no videotaping or other recordings.
And then the second clause under number 2, it says use of NAF conference information. NAF conference information includes all information distributed or otherwise made available at this conference by NAF or any conference participants through all written materials, discussions, workshops, or other means. Do you see that?
Yes.
And was it your understanding that any information provided by conference participants was included in conference information?
Yes.
And under number 3, it says disclosure of NAF materials to third parties. Attendees may not disclose any NAF conference information to third parties without first obtaining NAF's express written consent, which will not be unreasonably withheld. Do you see that?
Yes.
And so was it your understanding that the conference information we just talked about could not be disclosed to anyone outside of the NAF conference?
Objection, leading.
Yes.
Did you ever talk to anyone at NAF, any NAF employees, about the confidentiality agreements in Exhibit 8100?
Not that I recall.
Were NAF employees, was it a NAF employee who would hand you the agreement in Exhibit 8100?
Yes.
And if you had had questions, would you have been able to ask the NAF employee about those questions?
Yes.
What was your belief about whether the confidentiality agreements in Exhibit 8100 covered conversations that you had at NAF conferences?
I believed that it would be a safe place to have discussions about the work that is being done, and that everyone would have that understanding.
Did you consider NAF conferences to be private spaces?
Yes.
And so members of the public who hadn't registered for the conference weren't allowed to enter into the conference space?
Leading.
What was your understanding as to whether people within the hotel who hadn't registered for the NAF conferences were able to enter?
They were not able to enter.
Was it your expectation that conversations you had at the NAF conference would be shared with people outside of the NAF conference?
I didn't ever expect that to happen.
Did you ever expect that anyone would be videotaping you at the NAF conference?
No.
You said that NAF was a safe space for you. What do you mean by that?
Objection, asked and answered.
It was a place where everyone had goals and work ethic and similar goals. And so it was a place where you could have discussions about your own business or clinic goings on, or any services that were provided without any fear of it being disliked or sorry, I'm having a hard time articulating, but just that it was a safe place. There was no fear of any kind of anti-activity, anti-abortion activity. So it was just a place where everyone gathered and could discuss their own goals.
And what was it about the NAF conference that made you believe that the people there all shared similar goals in terms of, what made you think that people shared similar goals?
Well, they were people that I had known for years and years, most of them, although there are a lot of new folks coming up in the ranks, and discussing the reproductive rights and the health care that was given to women and men, so it was very obvious, actually, that the goals were very similar throughout the community.
And was there anything about NAF's vetting processes that made you believe that people at the conference shared similar goals?
They would make sure that you were who you said you were, and in an age of innocence, I suppose, you trust people, and you trust people to be honest and forthright with the information they're providing, and are actually who they say they are.
You testified earlier that you had met David Daleiden and Susan at the NAF conference. Is that correct?
Yes.
Who did they tell you that they worked for when you met them?
Biomax.
And what did they say that Biomax did?
That they acquired fetal tissue for research.
And what names did they give you when they introduced themselves?
I know Susan, but I don't remember what last name she gave at the time. I think, was it Robert Sarkis? I'm not sure if that was the correct name. I kind of dispelled it.
Mr. Daleiden didn't introduce himself as David Daleiden to you, is that correct?
No, correct.
Did you know at the time you were talking to Mr. Daleiden and Ms. Merritt at the NAF conferences that they did not actually have a tissue procurement company?
I didn't know that.
And did you know that they were not actually using their real names?
No, I didn't know that.
And if you had known that they were using their real names, or that they were not using their real names, would you have been speaking to them?
No.
And if you had known that they were not actually a tissue procurement company, would you have been speaking to them?
No.
Did you expect when you met Mr. Daleiden and Ms. Merritt at the NAF conferences that they were lying to you about who they were?
No.
And why didn't you expect that?
I didn't expect that they were lying to me because I trusted the vetting process of NAF and the honor of people to be who they say they are.
And you said earlier that, I think early on in your testimony when Mr. Jonah was asking you questions, that you didn't believe the conversations you were having with Mr. Daleiden and Susan Merritt were confidential. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And can you explain what you meant by that?
It was fairly general conversation, and there were people mulling about, so it wasn't like we were in a closed space.
And despite not believing that that conversation was confidential in terms of the content, did you believe that Biomax or Mr. Daleiden would disclose your conversation to other people outside of NAF?
Objection, leading.
I didn't think he would disclose it outside of NAF, no.
And was it your understanding that the confidentiality agreement, or strike that, what was your understanding of how the confidentiality agreement you signed at NAF affected anyone's ability to share the conversations you had with them?
Objection, vague and ambiguous, calls for legal conclusion, leading.
I'm sorry.
I'll restate
Yes,
it.
please.
What was your understanding as to how the NAF confidentiality agreement protected conversations that you had within the NAF space?
Same objection.
Everyone had to sign it. Everyone, and everyone, I believed that everyone was going to abide by these rules and regulations. So.
What was your understanding as to who the confidentiality agreements in Exhibit 8100 were meant to protect?
Objection, calls for legal conclusion.
Everyone in the conference.
And why do you have that understanding?
We all had to sign it. Everyone signed it.
I want you to turn back to Exhibit 4500. Before today, had you ever seen Exhibit 4500 that you recall?
Not that I recall, no.
And you didn't draft Exhibit 4500?
No.
And before today, had you ever seen Exhibits 4501 or 4502?
Not that I recall.
You testified a minute or two ago that when you were at the NAF meeting talking to Mr. DeLyden, that there were some people milling about in the background. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Did you have any knowledge of whether the people in the background could hear the conversation that you were having with Mr. DeLyden or Ms. Merritt?
I suppose they could have if they had gotten close in, but everybody was kind of milling about, so I don't know.
And do you know whether anyone, or did you believe that anyone was standing and listening in to the conversation you were having with Ms. Merritt or Mr. DeLyden?
No.
At some point, did you learn that CMP had released videos that they'd taken at NAF conferences?
Yes.
When did you learn that?
Shortly after they were revealed in July, I think it was, of 15.
And was that the same time when you learned that CMP had infiltrated the NAF conferences?
Yes.
Were you, at that point, did you know whether you had been videotaped?
I didn't know.
Had you learned before today that you had been videotaped at the NAF conferences?
No, actually.
And so when you were at the NAF conference, you didn't see Mr. DeLyden or Ms. Merritt holding video cameras?
No.
And you're surprised, are you surprised to learn that you had been videotaped?
Yes. Very.
I don't have anything else. For now.
Can we go off the record?
Sure. We're going off the record. Time is 2:44 p.m. We're back on the record. Time is 2:51 p.m.
Okay, so I just want to follow up on a few things you testified about. Did I understand your testimony to basically be drawing a distinction between certain conversations at NAF conferences, basically where you're discussing more general things, where you consider them not confidential, and then certain conversations might fall in a different category? Was that the distinction you were trying to make?
Objection.
I'm going to object that that's vague and ambiguous.
Mischaracterizes testimony.
Yeah, I don't understand.
Do you recall testifying earlier that you didn't think the conversation you had with David Delyden was confidential because you were discussing general things and there were people milling around? Do you recall that testimony?
Yes.
During the conversation with Mr. Delyden, you were discussing, and with Susan Merritt, you were discussing STEM Express and Kate Dyer and details of fetal tissue procurement. Do you recall that?
Objection. Foundation mischaracterizes her prior testimony.
Join.
But you,
Yes.
But you would consider that general conversation?
Yes.
Okay, so, okay. You also made a distinction about physical safety in terms of the purpose of the confidentiality agreement. Is that one of your understandings of what the agreement is supposed to serve to ensure the physical safety of the folks attending the conference?
I didn't say physical safety.
Okay, you said safety.
I said it's a safe place.
And what did you mean when you said a safe place?
asked and answered, but you can answer it.
That everyone in attendance, whoever I would speak to, was there with the understanding that everyone had been vetted, that everyone was who they said they were, that everyone had a common goal, that everyone was pro-choice. Safe place to discuss my services, the services of ABR, the work in the clinics. Safe place.
Okay. So the conversations that you had at NAF that you didn't think were confidential, like the ones where you discussed more general matters, you didn't think that those fell within the scope of the confidentiality agreement, did you?
I thought everything was under the confidentiality agreement.
Regardless of whether it was confidential?
It was all confidential. Excuse me.
That's all right. But you did.
And as far as the conversation that you had with David Delyden and Susan Merritt, you recall being in a crowded room in the exhibit hall with people milling around, correct?
Yes.
And those people were within earshot of you. They were close by, correct?
Yes, possibly.
And those people could overhear the conversation, correct?
Objection form.
Yes.
You testified earlier that you spoke to Beth Parker 6 months ago regarding clinics. Do you remember that?
Objection. This is outside the scope of my cross.
I didn't. I reserved my time not to respond to your cross, but
You can't just reserve time not to
Well, that's-
respond. Your time was to respond, and that
no.
was not within the scope of my questioning, so we're going to object to that.
That's absolutely not what I did. I specifically said I'm going to reserve the balance of my 30 minutes until after you're done. I wasn't going to only respond to what you covered.
Well,
so
that's not the way depositions
Well,
work, and you know that. So
that's-
I'm going to object as outside
okay.
the scope of my
Okay.
questioning.
Can you read the question back, please? I may also have an objection.
You testified earlier that you spoke to Beth Parker 6 months ago regarding clinics. Do you remember that?
So are you asking her if she remembers testifying about that?
Yes.
You
Yes.
can answer that.
And what do you remember about that discussion?
I'm going to object that this is outside the scope.
Join.
Do you remember discussing with Beth Parker about the California Attorney General case against David Delyden?
I'm going to object outside the scope.
Join.
Scope of what?
The permitted testimony, the scope of the subject matter.
Okay. You also testified that you spoke to Kate Dyer in 2017. Do you remember that?
Yes.
What did you discuss with her in 2017?
I'm going to object that's outside the scope of the testimony permitted by the order.
Okay. Do you remember producing documents to the defendants in this case pursuant to a subpoena?
Asked and answered, and also outside the scope of the testimony.
Join.
authorized by the court.
I'm asking about documents she produced
Yeah,
in this litigation.
right.
So,
It's outside the scope of the authorized testimony.
do you remember producing documents in this case?
It's a yes or no question.
Yes.
I just have a question for you about them. It's exhibit. I'll hand you what's been previously marked as Exhibit 2140.
Do you have, yeah, thank you. Okay, so I am, go ahead and mark it, and then I've got a statement for the record. Okay, this document appears to be statements of facility fees over a period of time, and I'm going to instruct the witness not to answer any questions concerning the financial arrangements between ABR and anyone else.
So I don't have a question about the financial arrangements. I just have a question about the production itself. And
No, that's outside the scope.
well,
We're also
let me-
not,
I'll
we're not here
ask-
to talk about
okay.
document production.
Well,
Ask a question, and
Okay.
then
I'm entitled to ask about basic issues that pertain to credibility. So I'd like you to look at the page that's stamped ABR 38.
I'm not seeing, oh, wait a minute.
And for the record, is
Yeah.
this exhibit made up of lots of different documents
Yeah, I
that were
apologize.
produced differently?
Yeah, and
Um,
I don't see a page marked AB, oh, I see, it's the
Yeah,
second to
first and
last,
end.
or third to last page.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is a document that ABR produced in response to our subpoena, and at the very bottom right-hand corner, it has an email address. It's for a statement of facilities fees dated January 2010. Do you see that?
Yes.
Action outside
Okay.
the scope.
The question, then, take a look at 2 pages down, which is the same document, the same statement of facility fees for January 2010, but it has a Planned Parenthood date stamp with 4505. Do you see that?
Where is it?
2 pages
I'm
down.
looking at the last page of the document.
Objection outside the scope.
Do you see that?
It's a yes or no question. He's asking you if you see that number at the bottom of
Oh,
the page.
excuse me, yes.
On the very bottom of the page, the footer that we looked at before that had the email address doesn't have an email address. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm, I do, yes.
Do you know why?
I'm going to
Objection
object and
outside
instruct
the
the witness not to answer. This is outside the scope of the authorized testimony.
Join.
Did you alter any of these documents before you produced them to us?
Same
No.
objection, same instruction, don't answer it.
Join.
Okay. Do you know Connie Cantrell from Cedar River Clinics?
Yes.
Objection outside the scope.
Have you spoken to her or met her at NAV conferences?
That's a yes or no.
Yes.
It was compound. Sorry.
Has she ever conveyed to you that she's told has she ever conveyed to you that they are projecting $250,000 in revenue from fetal tissue sales to STEM Express
Don't answer that question.
at a NAV conference?
Do not answer that question. That is asking about the details of communications at NAV conferences, which you've already testified you expect is confidential. And it's outside the scope of the authorized testimony.
You're testifying for the witness right now. She didn't testify to that, actually. So you're coaching the witness now.
I couldn't coach her if I don't know the answer. I'm just telling you the scope of your question is beyond what Judge Warwick has permitted you to ask about. It
have
doesn't
you
have
ever
anything to do with your
discussed-
expectations of confidentiality at NAV conferences?
Yeah, and the content of those discussions is relevant to understanding the expectation of confidentiality. So my question is, have you discussed projected revenues regarding for abortion clinics projected revenues at NAF conferences
Don't answer
in
the
connection
question.
with.
Go ahead.
Let me
Finish-
just okay.
Finish your question.
Have you discussed projected revenues abortion clinics can expect as a result of working with ABR at NAF conferences?
And you are instructed not to answer that question. It's outside the scope.
Julian?
You're aware, though, Counsel, that there's another trial set for December 2nd. It's a trial focusing on the plaintiff's claim for unfair competition. And the scope of that testimony is going to, the scope of the evidence that's going to be allowed in that case is going to include the social utility of the C&P videos, and there's going to be a separate trial with separate witnesses. So I'm going to make my record and ask my questions. You can, and I'm also going to use it as an offer of proof if we need to bring Ms. Tracy back. But
So it's your position that you can ask questions today for a different case?
it's the same case. The judge bifurcated the claims, and he's basically having a separate trial, a bench trial, on the UCL claim on December 2nd.
Well,
So-
if and when Ms. Tracy is called to testify in connection with that matter, we will confront those issues then. You can make whatever record you want. You've got, by my count, about 15 minutes left. So.
Okay. Okay. Let's take another look at Exhibit 8100, the NAF Confidentiality Agreement. Have you read this before today?
At the conference.
And take a look at paragraph 2. It says use of NAF conference information. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you have an understanding as you sit here today into what NAF conference information is?
Asked and answered. You can answer the question.
It is information that,
Well, I know it's actually defined in here, but I'm curious what if you have an understanding as to what it is.
yes,
And what's that?
it's information that's distributed by clinics and exhibitors, by NAF.
Okay. And the document, paragraph 3, discusses disclosure of NAF materials to third parties. Do you see that?
Yes,
Is it your understanding that this provision protects NAF from distribution of its own materials to third parties?
Objection calls for a legal conclusion. Document speaks for itself. We can answer it if you know.
I believe it protects NAF, yes.
Do you believe it protects anyone else?
Same objections calls for a legal conclusion.
I would think it would.
And what do you think?
About, do you have a more specific question you want to ask?
So the document we're looking at discusses the use of NAF conference information, and it has a section on disclosure of NAF materials to third parties. Would you agree with me that this is a document, based on your understanding, that protects NAF?
Calls for a legal conclusion. Lacks foundation. You can answer.
I do believe it protects NAF, yes.
And you said that you have some basis for thinking it protects people other than NAF. Is that your testimony?
It protects people in attendance.
In which way?
Vague and ambiguous. You can answer.
That people who have information to distribute to other members or attendees it would be okay to distribute without fear of it being distributed to hands that weren't in support.
Okay, so it's your understanding that you can distribute the information that you learn at NAF conferences to other people who you think support the mission of NAF?
Objection. Mischaracterizes her testimony.
I think it was meant for people within the conference, not for anywhere else.
Is it your testimony that you've never shared anything you've learned at a NAF conference with anybody outside of the NAF conference?
Say again?
Can you read it back, please?
Is it your testimony that you've never shared anything you've learned at a NAF conference with anybody outside of the NAF conference?
No. Not my testimony.
So you have shared information you've learned at NAF conferences with people who weren't at the conference. True?
Yes, my employees who would have a similar goal. So it would be beneficial to them to have some information, perhaps, that NAF or one of the clinics has shared confidentially with me.
Did you get NAF's permission to do that?
No.
Did you ask anyone if you would need NAF's permission to disclose the information to your employees?
No.
And have you disclosed information you've learned at NAF conferences to others besides your employees?
No.
So your testimony today, though, was that the conversation that you had with David Daleiden at the NAF conference was not a private conversation, it was not a confidential conversation, because you were in a place where people could overhear the conversation. True?
Objection. Mischaracterizes testimony.
Same objection.
I can break it down for you. You testified that you were in a crowded space when you spoke to David Daleiden, true?
Yes.
And you testified that there were people around that could overhear the conversation, correct?
Yes.
And you testified that you didn't think it was a confidential or a private conversation, correct?
I think that it was a private conversation. It was just between David or Susan and me. It wasn't for everyone to hear. It was a private conversation or conversations. But it was, if someone was around to hear it, they could. But it was also, in my mind, very confidential and very protected.
You didn't think that you were discussing anything sensitive. You thought you were discussing general matters with Mr. Daleiden. Isn't that your testimony?
No, I thought there were sensitive issues.
What was sensitive about them?
The use of fetal tissue is controversial to some folks. So it's a sensitive issue. Abortion is a sensitive issue.
Okay. So you've changed your testimony now at the very end of the deposition. So I want to make sure we have it clear on the record.
I'm going to object to that preamble because that mischaracterizes her testimony and mischaracterizes the witness's answers. But go ahead.
Your testimony earlier today was that you didn't, after looking at what Agent Cardwell testified to under oath, and after looking at his report, I asked you if you agreed with him that the conversation was not confidential and not private, and you said yes, you agreed with that. Do you remember that earlier today?
Yes.
And then I said, and that's because people could overhear the conversation, and then you agreed with that as well. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And are you changing your testimony now?
I guess I am, yes. I believe that when I spoke to them about our work and their supposed work, that it was a private conversation. It was, I didn't expect it to be out in the world, a conversation between two people. I didn't expect him or anyone else to go gossip about it.
Okay,
so in that respect, it was confidential and private.
Okay. So let me just draw a distinction between the two things we're talking about. You're talking about whether you had an expectation the conversation would be published or disclosed to third parties, and I'm asking you whether you thought the conversation was confidential and private. Maybe those aren't distinct things, but I want to make sure I understand your testimony. You didn't think anyone would publish or release a videotape of your conversation, correct?
Correct.
But you didn't think the conversation you had in that area was confidential or private, correct?
Correct. It was a public area.
Okay.
Public as far as the NAF conference goes, so that, not public in the world.
There were
public
people
within the conference.
Sure. There were people that you didn't know that were around you that could overhear the conversation, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Again.
How much time is left on the record?
You're at 1 hour and 48 minutes.
Oh,
With my time?
With your time, when you ended, you were at...
You're off the record?
Yeah. We're going off the record. Time is 3:13 p.m. We're back on the record. Time is 3:18 p.m.
Did I understand you correctly to say that you didn't know until today that you were videotaped by David Daleiden?
That's right.
So the first time anyone ever told you, or the first time you learned that you were recorded by CMP is today in your deposition?
Yes.
No one from Planned Parenthood ever reached out to you and told you that?
No. It was all about Perrin.
It was all about Perrin. Okay. And you don't recall being with Perrin during one of the conversations at that conference we looked at, the ISSCR or whatever? You don't recall that?
Yes, I recall that.
You don't recall speaking to David Daleiden at that conference?
Yes, I do.
You never had
But the only video I saw was the one of Perrin. Ever. Not me.
You don't recall thinking to yourself, I wonder if he recorded me too? You never had that question in your mind?
I wondered. I never knew.
And you never discussed that with an attorney or strike that? You never actually discussed that with anyone at Planned Parenthood, whether you were taped?
No.
And you never spoke to anyone from law enforcement about the fact that you were taped by CMP?
Not that I recall.
You never spoke to Congress about that when you were interviewed?
No.
You never spoke to anyone from the Attorney General's office ever about the CMP videos?
Not that I recall.
Have you ever spoken to the Attorney General's office ever about anything?
Not that I recall.
Have you ever spoken to the California Department of Justice about anything?
Not that I recall.
And the name Agent Brian Cardwell doesn't ring a bell to you in any way, shape, or form?
It doesn't.
You have no recollection of ever speaking to someone who asked you about being taped by CMP?
No, I don't.
You don't remember... You don't remember being identified as a potential victim by the California Department of Justice?
No. I don't know when that would happen.
And I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I'm just asking, do you have any memory problems?
No.
Okay. So can you say with confidence that you didn't speak to these folks, or that you just don't, is it your testimony that you just don't remember?
I don't remember ever speaking to them.
Do you remember ever being asked about speaking to David Daleiden and Susan Merritt at the NAF conference in 2014? Specifically that conference.
I'm sorry, could you read the question back for me?
Do you remember ever being asked about speaking to David Dyer and Susan Merritt at the NAF conference in 2014, specifically that conference?
Okay, so in responding to that question, please exclude any communications you may have had with counsel at any time. Okay, because he didn't limit it
Sorry,
to
it was
non-attorneys.
an unclear question. Do you remember speaking to anyone from Planned Parenthood or from any law enforcement agency or anyone about, other than your attorney, about the fact that, about speaking to David Daleiden and CMP at the NAF conference in 2014?
My husband.
Recently or a long time ago when the videos were first released?
So you're asking if I wondered if I had been videotaped? Is that the question? And that I asked my husband about that? Or talked to him about that? What are you asking?
Okay, so, no, I don't want to know what you asked your husband. I want to know if anyone other than your attorney spoke to you about the fact that you might have been taped at the NAF conference in 2014.
No.
Have you ever spoken to Beth Parker about the California Attorney General's case against Mr. Daleiden?
Not that I recall.
Have you ever spoken to anyone at Planned Parenthood about the criminal case against David Daleiden?
Not that I recall.
Have you ever spoken to Perrin Larton about the criminal case against David Daleiden?
Yes.
What do you remember talking to her about it?
Just wondering
Objection,
how
outside the scope.
Go ahead.
wondering how it was going to go.
What did she tell you?
Objection, outside the scope.
Do you have any... Well, go ahead. You can answer that.
And that'll be the last
Well,
question you answer.
I have
because
one question after that.
Well, your time
Yeah.
is up.
Well, I just have one follow-up question, so
Well.
go ahead.
We just talked about it, how awful and ridiculous it was.
Okay. Do you have any idea how it is that Agent Cardwell, in his sworn testimony under oath and in his report, references conversations with you about this issue? Do you have any idea how it is that they would think they spoke to you? Do you have
Right.
anything to offer to explain that?
Compound Blacks Foundation. You can answer it if you can.
I do not recall speaking to that person or recall the name. It may not have been something that made an impact, so it wasn't important.
Do you think he's lying about speaking to you?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
And now you're done.
Okay.
Do you have any other questions?
I don't have anything else.
Okay. You're done.
This concludes today's testimony given by Linda Tracy. The total number of media used was 1. We're off the record at 3:24 p.m.
Let me just say something for the record before you go off the record.
Strike that.
It's my understanding that Ms. Tracy's been served with a subpoena to appear at trial, and that you've accepted service?
Yes.
I just want to make sure that we're in agreement about that.
We are in agreement that we have a subpoena that we have accepted service on, but I think we're still talking about what date she would
Okay.
actually appear to testify.
Do you want to just discuss that offline later? Or
Yeah, let's do that offline
Okay.
later, because I don't know what the
Okay.
witness's schedule is, I don't know what you have in mind, and I
Sure.
don't know what my schedule is
Okay.
yet, so, all right?
Sounds good.
All right. This concludes today's testimony given by Linda Tracy. The total number of media used was 1. We're off the record at 3:25 p.m.